Liz Rust. There we go. Okay. Good morning. My name is Liz Rust, and thank you, Katie. Thank you, MHP, and thank you all for coming this morning to hear about local action units. I am going to get into my screen. Here we go. From the beginning with that. There we go. So this is information relative to after the zoning, collaborating with the LIP Local Action Program. And I will go through here. This is what we're going to talk about today. We'll do a little introduction, talking about the LIP, that stands for Local Initiative Program, Local Action Unit, LIP LAU for short. We're going to hear from Meghan from Lexington Planning, and then we'll have a Q&A break, a short Q&A break there halfway, and then we'll go into some more details. So I think we'll just start today with just a quick introduction. So if everyone wants to type into the chat your name, your geographical service area, where you're coming from, municipality, and what your role is. And that way I'll just keep talking, but that way you can all sort of see who else is here. I don't know now, I've kind of lost like how many participants do we actually have? 34 participants. So it gives a good idea of the range of interests and people who are attending. I know some of the people, I've seen their names come in, and so hi, nice to see you again. I wanted to start with just something about an RHSO. What is an RHSO? And so I'm Liz Russ from the RHSO. And so I only talk about this as sometimes in these programs, these housing programs, it's important to have some support about how to administer the programs. So for municipal staff, you know that this includes reviews of documents, preparation of some materials, and there's always some amount of attention, expertise, and time and resource for these housing programs. So this is one way of getting that. So these communities have joined together in a regional collaboration where they share housing consultants, which is I'm in there. There's 5 of us, and we provide these services to these towns. Different communities have found different ways to work on their housing programs in terms of staff support or individual consultants or whatever works for the municipality. The pace of activity varies, so the level of administrative or resource requirements will vary with that. But housing is a municipal service. And it's sometimes not recognized that way. There are very few communities that have housing specialists as part of their staff, but as many municipal staff know, that housing becomes part of someone's job, whether that's in the community development organization or the planning department or wherever it is. And so this is just one way of thinking about how to staff for that and how to recognize where in your community you could get that support. So when we talk about the LIP program, we say, well, what is this LIP program? Why would I use the LIP program? Once I permit the units and the developer builds them, why do I actually need this program? So one, it's an eligible program to get on the SHI, again, the subsidized housing inventory, and many people are familiar with that term. Through this material, you'll see things that say handout, and that refers to, I believe that Renee put in the chat maybe where the handout could be found, but it's a PDF that has backup materials as well as a copy of these slides for what we're going through today. So in order to get on the SHI, you have to be part of a program, and there's only, I don't know, maybe there's 40 programs that are eligible. And you need to be part and regulated under that program in order to be on the SHI. And the LIP LAU program is one of those. And it's the program that you will use always when you're creating new units through local zoning. So through the 3A zoning, the MBTA zoning, or inclusionary zoning, or those kinds of programs, you'll always use the LIP LAU program to get those units on the SHI. The other thing about the LIP program that's a huge benefit is it provides a regulatory framework. It has program guidelines. It has the legal forms of the regulatory agreement, the deed riders, consents, subordinations, and all of those forms, plus the lawyers who put those together. And that's a huge benefit. It's very difficult to put together those standards that are tried and true and tested through the courts for local programs. And we've seen throughout the years that different communities who have one form of a deed rider that they thought was great in the 80s, but here we are in 2026, and maybe it's not standing up through the test of time. And then it has the technical support. So technical support are people that you can call that can help you with any aspect of this program. So this is technical support available to municipalities, developers, and residents. So Ali Sapentino, I think she's on the call, so she's always there to take your calls to help through any questions that come up from the eligible developments, how to get things on the SHI, what's the lottery process, what about residents called with certain questions. So those are three very powerful and strong benefits for using the LIP LAU program. And the LIP LAU program is not zoning relief. So you can't use the LIP LAU program to get a exemption from your setbacks, for example. Like that's what 40B does, those things. It does not give you money. It's not a financial subsidy. And then it's not 40B. And for people who are familiar with the 40B process, there's an agency review before you go to the permit. The 40B process starts with what they call the project eligibility letter, which some think of as the ticket to the ZBA. The LIP LAU program does not have that. It doesn't mandate a timeline for the municipality or developers. So you could permit things in your zoning and have them in your special permit and think that, okay, it's all set and now it's all going to be done. But no, the LIP LAU process is separate and distinct from that. And it is not an automatic approval for the SHI. Again, it's a separate and distinct process that requires things to do, which we'll talk about. And here's what the process is. So it starts with the permit being issued, and from there, the LIP application can be drafted, presented by the developer. It's then approved locally. So the LIP application requires the HP, there's a lot of abbreviations here, the housing partnership and select board to actually sign that, or chief executive officer. Then it gets the state approval, EOHLC. They approve the application, they approve the marketing, and then from there, the regulatory agreement can get finalized and recorded. Then you execute the marketing, the units are built, they're occupied, they're put on the SHI, and then annual monitoring is done. Very simple, the 6-step process, and there you go. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of these coming up. On the foundational requirement standpoint, I just wanted to start with some basic concepts that all units that are intended to go onto the subsidized housing inventory, again, the SHI, must be marketed under an approved affirmative fair housing marketing plan, irrespective of what program you're using. So that's a fundamental requirement for really all of the units on the SHI. And here's some detailed requirements in these 40B requirements, Section 3, very important. It applies to all activities from outreach and marketing to occupancy and waiting lists. And everyone's responsibility is to follow these guidelines. So part of the guidelines would say things like you have to have transparent and open resident selection policies. So these are, people think of this as the lottery process, like you need to have the lottery process so that everyone has an equal chance to apply. And so sometimes people say, well, I have this unit and I know the person living there is income eligible. Why can't I put it on the SHI? And so part of it is you need to make sure that the person selected to move into that unit was given an opportunity from everybody to apply. So that's just another, part that's very important. The guidelines are also used with other programs and in conjunction with HUD-approved tenant selection plans, though HUD requirements will always take priority if there's any differences. So just to be sure that that's true. And that applies to some developments where there's multiple funding coming in. There might be some HUD funding as well as state subsidies, as well as 40B. And so you have a lot of similar but programs that might have some differences in requirements. And HUD will always take priority. And so speaking on the SHI, so I put all this as a high level before we get into the nuts and bolts of the LIP LAU program. There's 5 basic elements to count on the SHI. And counting on the SHI, a lot of people, a lot of permits, not people, but municipalities and projects, that's one of the objectives, that units count on the SHI. And sometimes that's used in permits as a shorthand. These units will be counted on the SHI because then it implies so many other requirements that don't have to be spelled out in detail also in the permit. But the occupancy must be limited to households earning up to 80% of the area median income. And that's up to 80%. It can be less than that, and some projects might be 60% of the area median income. But to be on the SHI, it has to be up to 80%. Housing units must be created under an approved housing subsidy program. I mentioned that before. There must be a recorded use restriction or affordable housing restriction, restricting occupancy and specifying other details. Again, that the LIP LAU program comes with their form, but other forms are also used for other programs. Housing units are subject to an affirmative fair housing marketing plan, and the maximum housing cost parameters are met. So that's the sales prices would be limited or the rents restricted. So at a high level, it's those 5 requirements that are always needed to count on the SHI. And speaking of the SHI, the timing for the LIP LAU units, because they're not part of 40B that I had mentioned before, on the ownership side, when the LIP deed restriction is recorded at closing for the individual unit, then they're eligible for the SHI. And for rental units that are new, when the regulatory agreement is recorded and permits issued, and then existing properties that are becoming rental, the regulatory agreement recorded, an occupancy permit, and executed leases. So this is different than 40B units, and 40B units are eligible for the SHI at the issuance of the 40B permit. So it's not the same here, just to be clear on that point. And if you have questions about any of these details, you can put them in the chat. And as I say, we have Q&A portions, a small one coming up, and then at the end, and we'll use the raised hand function at that time. So that's the big program, and so it's important to know what the municipal actions are. Like where does the city come into play with this? So sometimes a lot of the work is from the developer, and they're presenting and doing most of the material. So of course, the municipality issues the zoning permit. The municipality approves the LIP application, issues the building and occupancy permits, executes the regulatory agreement, supports the marketing period, annually certify compliance, and doing monitoring. So I've covered those before, but this is again, the 7 steps, and we'll go through those coming up. So for the zoning permit, this really sets the stage for everything that's going to come forward. And aside from things that the planners will always put into the zoning permits, the things that are particular to the affordable component or the affordable units are things like the number and specific locations of the affordable units. During the permit time, this is a great opportunity where you have the developer and you have the town and people are looking at the plans and there's some negotiation about how the project will integrate into the community. So this is the time to really say, well, which of these units are the affordable units? And let's look at their size relative to the market rate units when we look at all the floor plans. The bedrooms, the bath, the affordability level. Is it an 80% AMI level? Like just to be clear and to put those things in the permit so that down the line, there's no question about these things. Later on, when the units are under construction, is not the time to be thinking about which ones are going to be the affordable units, because often everyone will have a different assumption of what was meant back in the permit or back when the discussions were happening. I always talk about things like closets and storage and parking and some of these other pieces that sometimes aren't quite equitable between the units. It's important to talk about the timing of when the units are to be delivered, the timing of the regulatory agreement, the timing of the lottery relative to the occupancy permit for the market rate units. And we have some, and then preferences, whether you're going to use a local preference, whether, that's probably the biggest thing, or whether there's other parts of the project in terms of the residents. We have some suggested permit conditions that are in the binder or in the handouts, and then to consider monitoring agreements or after the permit, what might be the responsibility of the municipality. Okay, so there we go. Megan Roche. I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who's done a tremendous amount of work in Lexington around the LIP LAU, and she has some great things to share with the group.
Great. Thank you, Liz, and I'll start sharing my screen. Great, awesome. So just to introduce myself real quick, my name is Megan Roche. I am the Assistant Planning Director here in the town of Lexington. Been here just over 5 years. And Liz at RHSO and the wonderful staff at MHP have asked me to just spend a couple minutes just to talk about the processes that we have in place, focusing on our MBTA communities development and sort of some of the successes that we've seen in writing the decisions and assisting the developers. Just to set the stage real quick, to talk a little bit about our staff here, we do have 4 full-time staff members in our planning office, 3 planners and wonderful administrative support. Lexington, we do have a number of housing advocates from our Housing Partnership Board to our Affordable Housing Trust. And we're also a member town of the RHSO as well. So we get a lot of support and all of our questions answered from Liz and the folks over there. So again, I'm going to be focusing on our MBTA developments. So back in 2023, we passed our initial zoning to encourage multifamily housing development. At that time, we did zone for more than 250 acres of as of right multifamily zoning. So just a hair over what we needed to do, but that was through a lot of community input that we had zoned for 250 acres. And since 2023, we did have quite an influx of applications that I'll briefly mention on the next slide. But in 2025, through a citizens petition process, we did amend that zoning to pull back the number of acres, set some more limitations on density and unit counts. So we are still in compliance with that zoning, and we have received a number of zoning freeze plans through that process of amending the zoning to get to where we are at today. So here are some of our numbers, and I did actually update this as of this morning, but since adopting our MBTA zoning, our planning board has approved 10 multifamily developments, so totaling 1,081 new dwelling units and 158 inclusionary dwelling units. This is a combination of apartments, townhouse style, condominium, ownership units, and you can see here in this quick pie chart, our staff here is currently reviewing 440 projects. About 565 are in that, post site plan approval stage. Where are the developers going to go next? And 516 are currently under construction or just about ready for building permit issuance. And that is across 4 developments. So just to touch base real quick on our zoning bylaw, again, just for our MBTA developments, for any project that proposes between 10 and 13 market rate units, 10 to 13 units overall, 10% of those will be eligible for inclusion on the SHI, and again, limited to households earning 80% of the AMI. And for any development that proposes over 14, that 10% increases to 15%, limited to the same households earning 80% of the AMI. Our bylaw language does include sections about how these inclusionary units should be substantially similar in size, layout, parking, construction materials, any of the accesses and common areas that are available to the market rate unit. Occupants shall also be available to those of the inclusionary units as well. And then we also include the language in our bylaw specifically stating that no certificate of occupancy for any unit in the development, whether it's market or inclusionary, can be issued until those regulatory agreements are recorded at the registry. So we like to be, we try to provide as much description and quick information in our bylaws as possible so that any developer that's interested in moving forward with these proposals know right off the bat what they're going to need to include. And then so just discussing our site plan review regulations that the planning board has. Before any developer can apply with the planning board, we do require them to meet with all the departments in town for what we call a development review team meeting. So we have these, in our big conference room here that we have at the office. We also host it as a hybrid format, but essentially we ask that the project team come together with a representative from all departments in town. And that way we can talk about the project, answer any of their questions that they might have at that time, essentially before they present this to the public, sort of air out any of those issues before they apply. But it's also an opportunity for staff to really drive home the required information for these affordable units. It's during this meeting that we'll provide them with the income requirements, based on their proposal, how many affordable inclusionary units they'll need to provide. And then also, reminding them, and it won't be the first time that we do, that they'll be responsible for hiring the certified lottery agent to help them through that process. Our regulations will also require the applicant to provide, summaries and floor plans of the inclusionary unit locations. And then we had a few projects, and each time the planning board was discussing their local preference policy or their local preference for each site specifically. And at that time, they said, let's make a general policy so that going forward, we have something that both the applicants and residents can expect for each project. So they did decide that for any rental project that contains 20 or more inclusionary units, that no more than 25% of those would be available for a local preference component. In this table right here, some folks may have a similar one for their communities, but we did work with RHSO to set this up. The numbers that you're looking at here are for the 2025 income limits, but this is what we would provide to the project team early on in the process. So as they work through their numbers, they can understand, what's expected down the road for pricing out their units. And on this very wordy slide here, I have a snip of an example decision that we've written for an MBTA project that has 130 units and 20 inclusionary dwelling units. And really what I wanted to drive home on this slide is sort of we understand the steps that are needed to take to permit these units, but who's actually doing all of the steps? So here, what we found successful in Lexington is, again, we've been reminding that project team, you need to go out, find your certified lottery agent, and get started on the paperwork. As soon as you have site plan approval, if you know it's not going to be years until you're starting this process, go ahead, reach out, get the conversation started, and then have that lottery agent prepare the LIP LAU application, the marketing plans, the regulatory agreement, all the materials that are necessary. And then they'll hand that over to our planning staff to review it. Again, we're not the ones that'll be compiling for them, but we'll sit down and review it. I just did one the other day. Good timing. It was actually for this project that I have an example for here. And it took me an entire day. So 8 hours to sit down, look at that regulatory agreement, make sure that everything the planning board conditioned is included where it needs to be included. We would also review that for any of the local preference, again, making sure that if it met that threshold, that would also be included in the regulatory agreement. So planning staff, when we give it the okay, we'll send it to our RHSO staff to review it one more time for us. And at that time, it should be in pretty good shape, but they'll make sure it's all the final details are worked out there. And then once we get that approval, we'll take that, staff will actually take that and bring it to our housing partnership board and the select board for their review and signatures on those. So even that part of the process, just helping the applicant and the developer and say, you do the work, we'll help you get it to the people that need to review it and sign it. And then once we have the required signatures, then the applicant would submit that to the EOHLC. And then as we move forward in the process, once the applicant is ready to submit for their building permit plans, we'll review those quite thoroughly, again, to make sure any of the inclusionary units are just as they should, adequate and substantially similar to any of the market rate units. We in Lexington utilize the OpenGov online permitting system. I know quite a few towns that do that as well. But what's really beneficial there is that ensures that planning and planning staff actually review the building permit before it's issued. And that way we can put a hold on it if there's anything we're unsure about or any steps that the applicant hasn't met before issuance of the permit. And we also use an internal tracking sheet, which we'll share quite often with the developer as well to say, look, have you hired your agent? Have you drafted your regulatory agreement? Where are we in that process? So that when you're ready to close out the project and occupy those units, there's no delay and you've already taken the steps that you need to at that point. And when the project is just about ready and then they're ready to occupy those units, we'll actually go out and perform a site visit to actually see those units that were constructed. And we'll also ask the applicant to provide, written confirmation that they were designed as required by the regulatory agreement. And then once the occupancy permit is issued and the unit is actually closed on, then the units would be listed on the SHI. And that is just about it for our quick rundown of how we do things here in Lexington. Here's my contact information if anyone has questions on our processes here, and I will pass it back. And I think we have some time for some Q&A. So if you have any questions specifically for me here in Lexington or Liz, we'll use this time to answer those.
Hey Meg, this is Matt Dillon here. I don't know if I'm allowed to just jump in, but a couple questions for you. I'm next door in Bedford, and my wife and I are trying to build an affordable, a 10% affordable project here in town. And I was wondering how you guys came up with and calculated the max sale prices for the units there on that chart. I know it has to do with the area median income. And one of the most, and I'm just sharing this, I don't mean to pause and I can step back and we can have a conversation on the side. I don't know if it's for everybody, but the cost of building the units at this point, and one of the most challenging things about it has been the 10% affordable component of the project. We are hoping to sell it as condos, but it's going to cost us about $500,000 a unit to build them, and then we have to sell them at a loss. Is there any way that we could submit, the cost of our project and sell them at cost so that we don't have to eat a $500,000 loss? And hey, if this project's really successful, you don't mind giving, the 10% away affordable, but if my wife and I end up losing our shirts
Yeah.
and $500,000 when we don't know before starting the project, we have a special permit to move forward.
Yeah.
We're trying to make things work in a difficult environment. Is there any type of relief or what can we do to so that we don't start a project in the red majorly, and we want to get it going,
Yeah. I'm gonna say one thing quick, and then I'm gonna pass the numbers focused question over to Liz. But our 10% and our 15%, that is, that has been thoroughly reviewed by EOHLC to determine compliance. But we also were required to submit a feasibility study. So there might have been as a community, we might have said, well, let's make half of them all inclusionary units, but we couldn't. We went through a thorough process to be able to say, yes, it's feasible. Your community can set these at 10% or 15%. And then Liz, I'm sure you want to take over the income limit
Sure.
side of that.
Sure, I'm glad to do that. And we're going to have, I have a slide coming up on how to calculate the sales prices. But Matt, I think that that's one of the basic fundamentals here is that affordable units are always built at a loss, always. And that's just the economics of it. It's been the economics of it since I started so long ago, and it continues to be that way. And that we'll see that the rents and the prices are set so that they are affordable to the low income limit households. So they don't keep up with high property value, communities. And certainly as the construction costs go up and the $500,000 per unit, it doesn't keep up to that. So, the larger projects are more financially feasible because the fixed cost can be spread over more units. The smaller projects are very difficult without some kind of local subsidy. And that's often what happens in a small project, is that maybe there's a housing trust that can help, or, some other local organization that's interested in increasing the affordable, units in town. Thank you for that.
Yep.
I
Okay.
do
Thank
want
you.
to jump in with
Yes,
another question that
sure.
popped up. Um, is there a state list of certified lottery agents and sample minimum scope contract for the lottery? And I was going to start answering that communities that are in a regional housing services office typically rely on
Mm.
that entity to conduct the lottery. Is that correct?
So I think there's a few things. There's you need to have some technical expertise. So whether municipalities often aren't required to have come up with the lottery agent. Municipalities are often brought into play for resale of units. But to be a certified lottery agent, there's the certified occupancy specialist training that's offered, with the HUD requirements of how to do income certification. It always sounds like it's pretty easy, but it's in fact pretty complicated. There is lottery training that Mass Housing Partnership and Mass Housing and EOHLC offer, like in collaboration together. And I know that maybe later this year, perhaps something's going to be offered. And then there's mentoring or shadowing existing agents so that you have some practical experience. The worst thing that happens is in a lottery that is administered incorrectly, and you can't go back on that. You can't change the results. You can't change the ranking. If you rank applicants incorrectly, the person who got ranked number one incorrectly is never going to give up that spot. I'll just say,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, so it's
I am gonna
yes.
just as someone from, I mean, kind of state adjacent and in that world, there is not an official list of certified lottery agents. Um, we are aware of who does this. If you call MHP or Mass Housing in particular, or the LAU project, but there is no official sanction list. So with that, I'll.
Yeah. I see Eric has his hand up from Bedford. Hi, Eric. Nice to see you.
Hi, Bedford, by the way, I was looking forward to working with Matt and his family on that project. It's been in the works for some time. I only wanted to point out that there could be a couple of different scenarios where you have a like a local action unit project where the developer comes in and proposes a development that incorporates a certain percentage of affordable units that affordable housing trust funds could be put towards subsidizing. But when there's a project that is permitted through a special permit process and has an inclusionary requirement, in a lot of cases, those funds are typically not allocated towards affordable units that are conditionally required based on the density of the project that was proposed and approved. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have time at the end for more questions, but we just thought we'd take that break here. So I think we're going to go back to our material and go into, thank you very much, Megan. That was so informative. Lexington's done an awesome job at and creating a lot of housing. Like in the end, that's what's happening here. And it's actually happening, right? So there was some pent up demand on the 3A zoning when that got passed. And then those applications are coming forward. And even as the tariff environment was uncertain, the building permits came forward and units are actually being created. And now people are starting to, I don't know if move in, but pretty close to that. So great job. Okay, so I'm going to go back to here. There we go. Okay. And then here, am I advancing? There we go. There we go. We did that. Yeah. And so, whoops. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So the material picks up at when you are presented with a LIP application to review. So as Megan talked about, once the permitting has been done and now they have hired their lottery agent, once they've understood that they actually need to do that and how long this process might take. So they hired a lottery agent, and the lottery agent and the developer has submitted their LIP application materials to you, and you are to review those and to sign off of those. And sometimes you say, wow, look at all this material. Like Megan said, it like took her all day, and she's been doing this for a while. I always think of it as three parts of the package. One is the application itself and the affirmative fair housing marketing plan, which is one piece. The other is the plans, and you've seen these before as part of your permit, the permit itself, the site plan, the floor plans, and where the parking is, and then the legal components. So those are the three chunks. It's always nice to actually tell the developers, like, send me 3 PDFs, not 40 PDFs, not one PDF of 500 pages, but 3 different PDFs of these pieces. They're more functional, easier to look at. I don't know why that's not working for me. Okay. So in the LIP application, things to look at is there's a unit table there, like how many units are being offered as LIP LAU units, what is their relative physical size, what is their relative rents or sales prices, what are the condo fees, and so that's very important to look at that. And again, to always be comparing this to the permit that you issued. So is the material, are the information, is it the same as what you thought it was going to be? Then there's the property and unit information. So it's so important to know, what are people buying? What are they renting? What is this development? Where is it? What are the amenities? Where are people doing their laundry, or I don't know, whatever the things are. What is the sales and the rent, and the eligibility and the preferences, and like all the material. So what you're looking at is what the applicants will look at. So it's important to see, is the information clear? Is it concise? Can you understand it in English? That what if you were applying to buy a home, like, what is this home? Where is it going to be? What is it? What are the floor plans? What are the, everything you'd need to know about it. You can compare it sort of to an MLS listing. Of course, it's not going to have the same information. It's not quite so detailed, but it needs to be clear of what's being offered, as well as the procedural part, the regulatory part, and all of that. The lottery description, what is that timeline? Do people have enough time to apply? Do they have an information session? Like all of these kinds of things are really important. I always think that we are the eyes of the affordable resident before they're known, right? We are at the table. You are speaking for them with this material, because by the time they show up, this is already a foregone conclusion. And the more clarity in this information, the better, right? There's no surprises, and everyone knows exactly what they're getting. And then you know that it's exactly what you heard in your hearings. So when we talk about preferences, we're talking about things, and these are different from eligibility requirements. Eligibility is whether you're in the lottery, right? Like, do you meet the income limits? Are you a first-time home buyer? Like, whatever those requirements. And preferences are, what is the order of, once you're in the lottery, of who's going to be offered a unit? Once the things are ranked, who gets to offer? Who gets offered first? So accessible units are always offered first to people who need those features. There's not very many of them, and so if you need those features, those are siphoned off right at the top. And then there's a household size. We call it household size preference, but it's really is the household using all the bedrooms. So it's not exactly household size. It's more a bedroom size preference. So that the objective is that all the bedrooms are filled. So you could be a two-person household with an adult and a child and require two bedrooms, or you could be a four-person household with a couple and two children and still need two bedrooms. So again, it's not the number of people in the household, it's how many bedrooms that household uses. And that would take preference. So always that, again, trying to fill the bedrooms. And after that, there's a local preference, perhaps, whether this is, again, initial occupancy only, where at most 70% of the units could be set aside for households that have a tie to the community, whether they're living there now, working, someone in the household is working for the community, someone's children are going to school in the community. And there's policies and procedures for local preference as well as for all of this. And then note that age restriction is not a project parameter. Like either the project is age restricted and that's just part of it, or it's not. So it's not like the seniors will get preference over non-seniors in the lottery. So we have age restricted projects and non-age restricted projects. Yeah. Okay. So here we'll do a little bit with the numbers. So this is a little snippet from what we get from HUD. These are the area, income limits, right, based on the area here. They call this the Metropolitan Statistical Area, MSA. And they come out usually in the spring, kind of like April 1st, as a April Fool's thing, right? I think for the last couple of years it's been April 1st, and it's kind of incredible that the whole country nationally really depends so much on these numbers, and there's no set schedule from HUD. So they, we always have our ear out, like, are they coming out now and all this? And once they come out, many things change. And we look at everything's based on the number of persons per household. So I didn't have that here, but it's one person, two person, and goes up to 8 people here. And there's ways of extrapolating if you have larger households. So we have the 100% area median income, or what's also called the base income number. And so I just circled the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy area. And I think that's an area that has about 125 municipalities. So really the very much large, Boston area. And so the 16900, that's that number. That's the 100% area median income, base income number. And then the extremely low income is the 30% AMI. The 50% is what they call very low income, and the 80% is low income. Now, these are not arithmetically determined from the others, making it very difficult. I always know when people are starting their work in affordable housing, because the very first thing they realize is they can't get from one number to the other number by using their smart math. So we take these numbers as published, and we use them as such. There's in the HUD link here, there's a lot of information about how they come up with the numbers. And it's probably 30 pages with all sorts of mathematical formulas, and it's a whole science in and of itself, but we also could just take them as is, and we use those going forward with all the calculations. And so the first calculation that we'll talk about are the rents. And the gross rent, so this would be where we start from, is 30% of the monthly income limit adjusted for household size. So we have the two basic programs in this area. We have Mass Housing 40B, and we have the EOHLC LIP program, and these do it a little bit different. So, but here we're talking about the LIP LAU program, so we're going to use the number of bedrooms plus one. So what we mean by that is for a one-bedroom apartment, you would look at an income limit of two-person household. For a two-bedroom apartment, you're going to use the three-person income limit. So that's what that all means. And we start with that. We get 30% of that. So times, 0.3 and then divided by 12 to get your monthly number there. And that would be your gross rent. And then you subtract out the utilities that tenants will pay for. again, we're trying to come up with the housing cost, what is the tenant housing cost going to be? And we get those utility allowances usually from the local housing authority or some other provider. And the people who calculate this, know where to get those. And we subtract that and we get the net rent. And the net rent is really what some people might call that the contract rent. That's what's going to show up in people's leases. That's what the tenant will actually pay. So that's how that's calculated. So these are just some sample numbers here. The income limits aren't sample, those are actual. So it's the utility allowance there. And rents for other units funded by other programs may differ. So here we're just looking at the LIP program. And these are not the same as Section 8 fair market rents. Again, there's different programs that have different ways of coming up with these numbers, but this is for the LIP program. And then for sales prices, here are two examples. One is a condo, a two-bedroom condo, and one is what I call fee simple, but it was like a no condo, just a regular home, not regular home, but a non-condo. And I put up at the top how the prices have changed with the interest rates change. So they're very volatile to interest rates. So this is a calculator provided by HLC. So it's a standard spreadsheet, and the idea is you put in your parameters in the blue area, and the blue cells, and then it comes up with your monthly housing cost up at the top there in the yellow, and then down below is how much household income is needed for that housing cost, and you're trying to balance the housing cost with the principal and interest based on the interest rate, the local property taxes, the PMI, and the condo fee and insurance. Those are all the components that factor into ownership housing costs to calculate this sales price. And that's balanced against the income limit for the number of bedrooms on the bottom and an affordability window of 10%, that is the standard. So you can see in the top table that over time, the interest rate really changes things a lot. So back in May of 22, here was the, whoops, no, see when I do that, it just changes, right? So I can't highlight here, but you can see that the prices were like 279.9, 280 essentially for the two-bedroom condo. And as the interest rate in, a year went up to 8%, that price decreases. The more you're spending on your interest and principal, the less you have to spend on the more that that takes away from the sales price
Supposed to be adding
because you're spending more of your housing money on that principal and interest for the same amount of mortgage. I don't know if I said that clearly, but yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at that. If you have other questions, we can talk about that. But this is like, again, nuts and bolts behind how these are calculated. And again, it's based on the number of bedrooms on the bottom. So all one bedrooms are treated the same. This came up recently, like a one bedroom with a den is treated the same as a one bedroom without a den. So it's not square footage based. It's bedroom based. It's again towards the number of bedrooms and the households that can be housed in that unit. So in step 2 of the LIP application is approving the application. So again, the premise here is that the LIP LAU is supported locally, of course. And so it gets approved by the local housing partnership or trust, then the mayor or select board, and then submitted to EOHLC. So Meghan talked about that. They provide a nice service there to shepherd this through municipalities, through these boards. Sometimes getting on the agendas and getting it through the boards, it might take a month. It might take a little bit more than a month to get it through. So even once the package is complete, it takes a little while to get there. And then once it gets to HLC, there's a review process. There's a get in the queue process. And then once you get to the top of the queue, there's a review process. And then once it's approved, then marketing can start. The regulatory agreement, which in this case constitutes what is known as final approval. That means that the application and the project is approved to go forward. Three originals are needed for the regulatory agreement. And I only highlight, bold, underline that because sometimes we could drop 2 months right here in executing the regulatory agreement and getting it recorded. Is the right notary block signed? Did this one sign first? It's three originals, wet signatures, and all of them. So there's some logistics here that are helpful if time is a consideration. So once the regulatory agreement is recorded, then things can start. Then the timeline for actually going forward, the paperwork has been done, and now we can start open the application period, start marketing. See where I am here. And moving into getting applicants and bringing the opportunity forward publicly, which is what everyone's been waiting for. At that point, there's final sales prices and rents. So I mentioned that because sometimes, this is a long process. We're going through this very quickly here. It sounds like it's just going to, but it could easily be 6, 9, 12 months here. Sometimes the developer is not ready. We don't want to start marketing until the units are actually going to be offered for occupancy within 6 months, let's say. Otherwise, we have to, keep recertifying the applicants and the tenants, and people are thinking they're buying something, and then they're just waiting and waiting and waiting. And it's really a buyer's renters market. That if they're ready to buy, they have lots of opportunities. And the prices, as you see how they were calculated, are, kind of the same everywhere. A little variation based on municipal tax rates and condo fees, but very similar. So ready buyers on the ownership side have a lot of opportunity. So sometimes waiting for the right time to start marketing. There might have been a change in new income limits have come out and therefore new sales prices or rents. And especially with interest rates, as interest rates change, that final sales prices and rents don't happen till right before marketing, and local approval is usually needed at that point. So again, we're focusing here mostly on what the municipal actions are. And so local approval. So even after everything's been approved, the developer will come back and say, oh, need to update this for the new income limits and the new sales prices and rents before we start marketing. And then it's time for outreach. And I think that something that I wanted to highlight for municipalities here is to do local outreach. Sometimes there are developments that come up and they're not posted on the town website or the city website. And the lottery agents have their list and they've provided that to you. But being able to put it on your weekly newsletter that you send out or your Facebook, or making sure that all the boards and committees know, or town employees, or all those things. We feel so strongly about offering housing for people in our community, or workforce housing for the people who work here, but making sure they know about it is really key. And so the municipality has a great opportunity to do that. I encourage people to attend the lottery information sessions and to get demographics for them. How many people applied? How many people applied to your lottery? And so that you start getting a sense of what is the need? What are people looking for? How strong? And then, of course, SHI eligibility, and we've talked about that a few times. Oops. Yeah, so here we go. So municipal opportunity, exclamation point, website, employees, boards, committees, and really who keeps the interest list? Like when people call you, is there a central person who would keep a list of like, okay, this development's coming. How do I hear about it? And if you have a lot of different developments in your community, you might have 3 or 4 different lottery agents. So the lottery agents aren't going to be your central source because they're working for the developer, and they might just have this one, and then there might be, as I say, 3 or 4 different lottery agents. So someone in the municipality is often keeping the interest list, or and it's always good to assign that person or to know who that is. And then to get from the developers from each lottery, like how many applicants, how many local applicants, and then to be able to consolidate that over time so that you can see, like, oh, over the last 3 years of the lotteries in our town, this has been the response. This has been the demand. This is where people are applying for. And I think that that's great information for you. Oops, sorry. Okay, so the regulatory agreement. So the HLC regulatory agreement is an excellent document, I have to say. So it has everything. It is it is a legal agreement, and it has a lot of important parts. It talks about rents, it talks about occupancy, it talks about marketing, it talks about all the things that are important in terms of managing the initial offerings as well as the ongoing responsibilities. And it does have this one part of municipal certification, and this is often overlooked, that in the regulatory agreement. So there's two kinds of regulatory agreement. One is for ownership and one is for rental. Both of these are in the handouts. And I'm not going to stop screen share and go there, but and it has this phrase in both of them that throughout the term of this agreement, which is in perpetuity, so it's really a long time, the chief executive officer shall annually certify in writing to EOHLC that each of the low and moderate income units continues, and it goes on. So it's really the key there, shall annually certify in writing to EOHLC. So there's a very specific and formal obligation for the municipality to certify and to manage the compliance of the units in the LIP program, the LIP LAU program. So this is something that you'll want to be aware of, I'll just say. Yeah, and so that's in the regulatory agreement, and we'll talk about that in the monitoring section coming up next. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention in the regulatory agreement was the concept of fixed and floating units for rental units. Sometimes that's overlooked. So fixed units means that always unit 203 would be affordable. And floating would mean that initially unit 203 is affordable, but it might change to unit 405, or I'm just using those as examples, over time. And floating is a much more flexible um, system for the developer and the municipality, and really encourage you to look at that. With a fixed unit, people change over time, and maybe people's income increases, and it's increased over the limits for the affordable program. So if it was a fixed unit, you would require them to move to another unit, like move to a market rate unit. And we don't want to require people to move for programmatic pieces. Floating would say, oh, if they are no longer eligible for the affordable program, then the next unit of similar type would then become an affordable unit. So it's a much more flexible way. It also ensures that all of the units are outfitted or trimmed out at the same level across all the units, because any one of them could be affordable in the future. The regulatory agreement also discusses rent increases, and as the income limits go up year over year, the rents also go up year over year, and understanding and managing the rent increase request, approval, and implementation process is really important. Okay, so now everything's built. People are living there. They're in their leases, and now you're in the role of municipal monitoring. So let me just see what I have here in front of me. Okay, so we'll talk about rental monitoring, ownership monitoring, and just annual reporting. On the rental side, there are really just back up. Underneath this is that part that we talked about before, which is the municipal requirement to annually certify to EOHLC. So underneath that, also annually, developers are going to ask for approvals to increase rents. They are required in the regulatory agreement to deliver to you annual reports, and there's a marketing review. Just hold on one second here. Yep. And on the ownership side, monitoring takes the form of annual certifications, helping people with refinancing, looking at that, capital improvements, resales, as well as annual reporting, and then general resident inquiries. You know, these developments go up and there's actual buildings there with actual people, and they want to talk to you. They have questions, they have concerns. So on the rental monitoring, just drilling down a little bit of what I was just mentioning, we look at 5 pieces when we talk about rental monitoring. We look at whether the monthly rents that are being charged to tenants are less than the maximum approved rents. We look at whether tenants continue to be eligible based on the annual reports that we get from the property managers, that they meet the recertification limits. We looked at the units are physically maintained. We looked at the number and mix of affordable units is consistent to what was approved, the same amount of 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 1 bedroom, and that the units continue to be affirmatively marketed so that they're listed for rent. If the waiting list is open, that it's on Housing Navigator, for example. So those are the 5 pieces looking at under the rental monitoring. And then so then here we go, rent increases. This is a big topic. And for people who have been involved with rental properties, usually see that they get requests for rent increases after the income limits are updated. We talked about how the rents are calculated, so you can see that the income limit really drives the maximum rent amount. So the rent limits come out, and there's some properties, and it won't be 2 days before you will get the requests for approving those rent increases. And you'll want to have the annual report and last year's rent increase available to look at before doing the analysis of whether you're going to approve the rent increase or how you're going to review it. The regulatory agreement allows for the rent to increase based on the income limit. And here's some detail about this. There's a lot of information here, and I just try to get something in here. So I put over here in this far right bottom corner the percentage increase in the income limits for the last 12 years. So you can see, it's varied. So this last year was only 1.6%, but the year before that was almost 10, and then it was 6%, and then it was almost 11. And so those kinds of, year over year rent increases are very burdensome to many tenants. How HUD does this, these income limits. So for 2025, they use the median family income data from the 2023 American Community Survey, and then they updated it with wage growth, 8% since 2023. So that's a very shorthand of their analysis of how they come up with that. So, and then prior to that, they used an inflation forecast from the CBO. But, as I mentioned before, they have a lot of detail about how they come up with the income limits. Over COVID, because COVID was right there in that 10, 11% rent increase, and things were very tough financially for renters. Things were tough financially for a lot of people. There was a policy from EOHLC to not approve any rent increases, I believe probably in 2021 or 2020. And then in 2021, EOHLC had a policy of the lesser of the calculated rent, which we've talked about the calculated rent, or 5%. And that was for renewals. So the thought was that new people coming in could come in at the maximum rent, but for renewals, it would never be more than 5% renew increase. And then in 2022, EOHLC urged continuance, and then then they didn't have any new policies on that. We have since then in the RHSO, when I say we, in the RHSO have worked with the big property owners to continue that practice of the lesser of the calculated rent or 5% for renewals. But the regulatory agreement does allow for this maximum rent based on the income limits. I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot that can be done there. There's a lot of work in the municipality to understand this, to pay attention to it, to decide how to work with developers on that, and to get involved. Moving to the ownership side, the best practice there, and the requirement is to send out self-certifications to all your owners in restricted properties. Do you still live here? Come back and tell me that you do. We also review the registry of deeds to make sure that there have been no unapproved financing or transfers. Sometimes people transfer their deed into a trust, which is without prior approval, no matter that the deed restriction says you cannot do that. And again, review the approval, the resale, refinance, capital improvements. And after the income limits come out, we usually get requests for what's my unit worth now? What's my home worth now? What's my home worth now? We get those requests frequently. And again, both of these monitoring get captured in a report to annually send to EOHLC to satisfy the annual written compliance to HLC. So that's the life cycle of the LIP LAU program, through all of its getting the LIP LAU application, through municipal opportunities for outreach and encouraging applicants, through to the monitoring. And so I'll just end with the key points here of ensuring the LIP materials provide clarity about the entire process. Again, that's very important. Know your role and the required timeframes, from the municipality. You're not responsible for everything, but you are responsible for some things. So know which ones you're responsible for so that it's not a surprise and that you're doing that job. I think it's important to identify internal responsibilities so that when people call, they know you know what to do. Again, that's part of the municipal role, that the housing partnership knows what their role is, and staff and all of that, and to lead the municipal process. So the developer plays a key role. I mean, it's their project, it's their money, it's their development and all that. But there is a municipal function here that's very strong, as you could see here, all the parts where you get involved and to provide leadership there to make the projects be the best they can. And there we go. Now we'll do some Q&A. Here's my contact information. I'm always glad to answer any questions and to either here or even after the fact. Ali Sabatino is on here, and that's her information. So she manages the LIP LAU program, and she's awesome to work with. And Megan here as well. So I'm going to do a stop share and then take any questions or things that have come up.
I hope people put in questions. This was so good, Liz. You really, that must have been hard to pack all that in, but you did it. You had a question from Emily DeHoo. Would the project still be in compliance if the project has floating units? I assume that means, with rental apartments, they're not in the same place. The initial designated affordable units, which they can't be designated, are over the minimum size requirement for the number of bedrooms, but the new designated unit is under the minimum requirement for size for the number of bedrooms. And we can let Emily further this. She then clarifies size equals square footage, and that's when this question stopped making sense to me.
Yeah, so a lot of times we hear from project property managers that they want to switch. They got approval for I don't know, unit 402, but the person there, they want to switch. They want to go to this other unit because it's on the first floor and this, and it's a different size, or maybe even a different size in terms of square footage for the same bedroom size. And they'll ask for approval for that, which is great and very proactive. And so the municipality will approve that. Um, or sometimes they just switch and they forget to ask. And it's really up to the municipality how you want to handle that. But usually there's a good reason for the switch, or sometimes you know, there's not a good reason. I don't know. So
So if it's floating, so they can choose to have floating units if someone goes over the income,
mhm,
and then it can go to a different unit and say that it's a 2 bedroom, it needs to be 900 square feet
mhm,
or more. And the one that it switches to is 850 square feet because that's what's available.
mhm.
Is that still okay? Do they need to request when they do?
They should always request
Okay.
because, the municipality was involved in setting which units were designated initially.
Right.
And to make sure that you think that the request is genuine, and that there's a good reason for it and that you're going to accept a smaller unit in its stead for whatever reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it still would count, even if it's under that
Yeah.
threshold of
Yeah.
900. Okay.
Especially with your approval, especially with your approval.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else?
I did include the link to the Housing Navigator in case people were not
Okay.
familiar with
Yeah.
that. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. It's
The
an
Housing
amazing.
Navigator started as a, I think it was a funded initiative from subsidizing agencies. It's a requirement for if you have public subsidies that you advertise on there, and it's quickly become the central registration spot for all affordable units, for all affordable rental units. It has a huge amount of information, and it's great for you in the municipality to check that all the properties in your municipality are listed there, just to make sure that, because that's where people go to see what's available. So you might have other listings of your affordable inventory, but really Housing Navigator is where to go. So we always ensure when we do rental monitoring, that's the first thing that we do, that they're listed there and that the information is available. So I think someone asked, is it possible to not designate the affordable units in advance so that developer I lost it already, is incentivized to make all the units identify and then down the road identify them? I think when the LIP application is submitted, the affordable units need to be identified to ensure that they are not inferior in some other way. And you can require to make the units identical or equitable, in their features and their appearance from the outside and interior through your permit. But maybe someone else wants to also comment on that. I don't know. Ally, are you
No,
here?
there was one more question that I
Sure.
think we could clear up here. Would acceptance of a unit switch, we seems to be really focused on that, require a voucher or housing authority approval? I don't think housing authority has anything to do with it, but
No, I mean, people who have vouchers, I mean, the vouchers require HQS standards to be followed. So vouchers, you will want to inspect the unit to make sure it meets the HQS standards. So, and so I think if you have a voucher, you're not switching units easily, and you will have to get if the new unit does not have a certified, HQS inspection, they will have to do that, as they had to do when they moved in.
Liz, I just wanted to say that I answered the question in the chat that you were talking about before, and we had the same answer. So,
Perfect,
yeah.
perfect. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't see that. Okay. I'm going to turn it back over, I guess, to you all at MHP if there's no other questions.
I'm gonna refer you to Reneri if she's there, uh, to just jump in. Thank you. I know there was a housekeeping detail. Let me remember what it was. Ah, okay. Again, resources will be shared in the chat, and all this materials on the housing toolbox. That's really the end, but I'm so grateful you guys came. There's been a lot of activity around the LAU space, and I mean, I hope Allie concurs. The more, the better. It's a powerful tool, and we should all use it.
Yeah. And I know that there was a lot of details shared here, and maybe I went quickly through them all, but it's a detailed program, and it's depending on your role, you might need some of that detail, and maybe it's just having a good appreciation for those that are administering the program.
Thank
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.